Welcome to Wide Angle. Today we are looking at India's maritime engagement. We have just had a very successful visit by the Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Tan Dung, and before that the maritime dimension also found mention during Prime Minister Modi's visits to both Japan and to the United States. Asia will account for more than 50% of global GDP by 2020 or even earlier. And with that, the trading links, the sea lanes of communication in Asia will assume greater importance. And looking at that, and what does this mean for India's maritime engagement, we have this evening Admiral Kaushev, former Commandant of the National Defence College, Suhasini Haider, Strategic and Foreign Editor of The Hindu, Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, who is not only served as our ambassador to the Philippines, but is also coming out with a book on the diplomatic dimensions of India's maritime policies very shortly. Welcome. If I may start with you, Admiral, what are the takeaways from the focus on defense cooperation most recently with the visit with Vietnam?
With Vietnam, we have had a fairly close economic and defense cooperation over years. But this Vietnamese Prime Minister's visit has underscored and re-emphasized some of the more important dimensions, particularly some of those which had received a bit of question mark in the recent past in the media, etc. It has emphasized now that the two nations are well on their way to cooperating in the maritime domain in terms of ship visits, in terms of training, in terms of
but we are now going to sell them some fast patrol vessels,
offshore patrol vessels.
Offshore patrol. There is also talk of sales of the BrahMos missile, which would be a major development.
Yes, and in fact BrahMos they had sought for some time, and we had to get Russian clearance for that, which has now been received. So it's only a question of time that this will be agreed to. So there is a very close engagement in the offing between Vietnam and us, which is historically at the right time and the right place, correct things are happening.
So Hasini, one of the issues with Vietnam, and it also came up now because there was an additional MOU that was signed with regard to new blocks for oil and gas exploration. And in recent years we have seen that some of the exploration activities undertaken by ONGC Videsh have led to concerns being expressed by China. What do you make of the fact that now there are more blocks being offered and we are ready to move forward in this area?
Well, to be accurate here, the blocks that are under consideration, the two that the MOUs have been signed for, are in fact inside the 10-dash line. They're not part of the contentious areas between Vietnam and China. The entire block of 5 that was offered to India, out of which they chose last year, are in fact outside that line. Even so, we heard a comment from Beijing.
That's right.
We heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying that China views all these deals really in the prism of China's strategic concerns. And if anything goes against China's strategic concerns, then certainly China will oppose it, making some strong statements on both issues of India's strategic partnership with Vietnam, certainly that part about giving them patrol vessels, also making those adverse comments, depending on how you read them, about the oil exploration. Let's remember in 2011 China had actually issued a démarche to India on the subject of blocks 127 and 128, which are in fact in contentious waters. So there was no question that China will be watching this visit very closely to see what India does next. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs was equally strong, equally strident when they said this is really a bilateral issue, we're not interested in any third parties. I think what you're seeing is a general toughening of India's position. The fact that President Pranab Mukherjee was in Vietnam, even as President Xi Jinping came to Delhi. The fact that these messages have gone out, not just from here, but from Tokyo, when the Prime Minister went to Tokyo, the South China Sea coming up in India's joint statement with the US, I think what you're seeing is a toughening of position and an articulation of India's idea that it has a strategic value inside this particular arena.
Yogi, we saw that in Tokyo, Prime Minister Modi spoke of expansionist powers, quote unquote, without mentioning names. But I think the reference was not lost on anybody. in the US, there was a reference to, as Suhasini said, to safeguarding maritime security in the South China Seas. And do you think, as Suhasini has pointed out, do you see this visit by the outcome of the visit by the Vietnamese Prime Minister as a continuation of what Suhasini describes as a hardening of India's stand on the maritime dimension?
I think that could be a right reading of this, in the sense that we are getting more upfront as far as South China Sea is concerned. In fact, there are two interesting things I noticed. That for the first time during in the joint communique between India and US, when Prime Minister was there, not only was there a mention about freedom of navigation, but also overflights. And overflights also is a bit of a red herring for the Chinese, because when the US National Security Advisor had gone to China, they especially raised the issue, the US side, that they should allow these overflights near the Chinese, not in their air territory, but outside, allow these flights to take place, and that they should not be confronting why this confrontation actually keep taking place. And exactly the same formulation you find also in the Indo-Vietnam joint communique. So that actually,
that's very interesting.
Yes. So you find that, and also the entire language, particularly, in fact, no, the joint communique itself is quite explicit on this, but both the Prime Minister's media statement and the Vietnamese Prime Minister's media statement is even more explicit. For example, as far as the Vietnamese Prime Minister is concerned, when he actually spoke at the media statement, he said that both sides agreed on the importance of maintaining peace, stability and maritime security and safety, resolving disputes in the East Sea by peaceful means the basis of international law, including 1982 UNCLOS, fully and seriously implementing Declaration of Conduct of 2002, and striving for an early formulation and completion of the Code of Conduct in South China Sea. That's one. So that's quite explicit.
And on the Indian side, what was said?
On the Indian side, the Prime Minister said that we are actually we want to cooperate fully in terms of modernizing the security.
Modernizing Vietnamese defense and security.
Especially the Navy, particularly the Navy. And the other thing, in fact, the Vietnamese Prime Minister said that Vietnam highly appreciated India's position regarding East Sea issue and India's cooperation with Vietnam in oil and gas exploration, extraction in the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf of East Sea. So all of these actually, in a way, that said that this certainly does suggest that we are actually not only just looking east, but as the External Affairs Minister said, we are also acting east, which is actually in a way a throwback to Obama's statement when he came to India, when he addressed that,
Now, we know that as Indian economy grows, our dependence on sea lanes of communication, because 90% of our foreign trade by volume is seaborne, and more than 70% of our oil and gas comes to us along on sea. So, in the absence of pipelines at present. So therefore, as the Indian economy grows, this dependence is only going to increase. This brings us to the issue of choke points. And we have choke points, Admiral, both on the eastern side, the Straits of Malacca, and also on the western side. Would you throw some light on how these choke points impact, or how they should impact on our naval presence in the region?
Yes, actually, I'll start off with the Indian Ocean is the third largest ocean on this earth, as we all know. But it's the unique one in which it doesn't have north-south access directly. And it has got natural choke points which make it possible for somebody to interfere and make it impossible
make it a lake.
Yes, impossible for somebody to go past undetected. So to that extent, it is unique. And India's position in the Indian Ocean itself is unique, because you sit astride the complete global lines of communications of trade, global lines of energy flows, and therefore this is a very strategic location. We didn't seek it, geography naturally endowed upon us. And what
does this imply for the Indian Navy?
This implies that India has, as a responsible member of United Nations, as a responsible nation, the Committee of Nations, has a responsible role to play in the maritime domain, which now we are increasingly coming along to the stage wherein we can play that role. For quite some time, we had the role, but we didn't have the capability or the capacity, which we are building up now.
Do you think we have the capacity today?
Well, certainly we have the capacity to the extent that we have demonstrated it in a very small way during 2004 tsunami, wherein it brought us center stage for global visibility.
On humanitarian and
Yes,
disaster relief operations.
etc. And it gave Indian Navy visibility, it gave Indian Navy recognition globally. And nowadays, Indian Navy is exercising with some 8-9 countries, all of them of any maritime reckonable maritime capability. But there's an interesting one in this, that we have insisted for some reason that we'll have only bilateral cooperation exercises. It's time for us to take a serious look at this and go multilateral, because that is the economical way of doing it. That is a cost-effective and more useful way of doing
so
cooperation.
I thought we had agreed also to some trilateral naval exercises.
Well, we do have trilateral exercises with Japan and Australia. What has actually taken a backseat.
And also the US?
That has taken a backseat over the years. That quadrilateral exercise was not something India was very comfortable with at that time when the US was trying to pivot towards Asia. And in fact, it was something specifically we asked the Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott when he came to India last. And he said actually the quadrilateral engagement is not something that's on the front burner right now. But certainly these are all...
But India, US, Japan, I thought during Prime Minister Modi's Japan visit,
that trilateral
has a green light.
No, in fact that trilateral has been taking place.
Yes.
So the trilaterals are working, the quadrilateral is certainly not working. I think just to add to what the Admiral was saying, that what we are demonstrating by this sort of detente with Vietnam is not just India's position when it comes to an energy-hungry country, a country that is now looking to secure its energy supplies. It is looking to ensure in some ways that it is part of the international architecture, if you like, of ensuring that these maritime lanes stay free. And then finally, in calling Vietnam one of India's most important defense partners, Prime Minister Modi said it is one of the most important defense relationships India has by giving the line of credit. We're not just selling these naval vessels to them, we're giving them the $100 million line of credit.
And if the
BrahMos
missile deal happens, I think that would be a very significant opening.
Absolutely. And that's not all. We're also going to help train them when it comes to submarines, when it comes to Sukhois possibly. We certainly have a lot in common because both of us depend on Russian hardware. What we're showing ourselves as is also a military power in that sense.
Yogi, the Chinese announced the 9-dash line, and you know, when that started coming out in a big way, it created a lot of, it created a major flutter, shall I say. So is this what you're seeing coming out from Delhi, is this a kind of response to that 9-dash line?
I think the 9-dash line, I would say that even the ASEAN itself, I would, of course, you can say that ASEAN members have varying positions, but they all actually, in a way, feel that 9-dash line actually has no basis in law. And in fact, that is one reason why you find that Philippines, and now we've been hearing the Vietnam also wants to take them to the UN, that Commission on Continental Shelf. It lost. It's an arbitration panel there. And the idea actually is in a way to make the Chinese position on 9-dash line as untenable as possible in the public, international public view, because of the fact that it has no basis whatsoever, even international law. But of course, as you know, that these things, you know, they thrive on hyper-nationalistic feelings all around, and because of that. And also the other thing is that Chinese diplomacy is in full flow. I mean, as you know, whether it's countries like Cambodia or Laos, or to that extent even Myanmar, they actually take a backseat on these issues. And in a way, the fissures within the ASEAN actually are widening because of this.
We are looking at India's maritime engagement. Admiral, if I may turn to you, we've looked at the importance of the choke points on the eastern seaboard, namely the Straits of Malacca. Now on the western seaboard, the Straits of Hormuz is also often described as a choke point. And which are the countries on the western seaboard with whom you think India would be able to have or has a meaningful maritime cooperation possible?
We have actually, if I may mention, two features of maritime cooperation or maritime interest. One is the stake, that whoever's lines of communications or lines of trade or lines of energy flow through an ocean area, even if the country is not resident there, is a stakeholder in that region. Insofar as cooperation is concerned, that is determined by your capacity and the capability. Location matters, but not entirely. India is centrally located to be able to, as we have seen in case of piracy response, we were able to field our ships continuously for 5 years. We had 6 years we had ships in the Gulf of Aden there. But Gulf of Aden is actually a very interesting sea area. That choke point at Bab el-Mandab is very interesting because NATO forces are there, EU forces are there, Tier 151 is there, and they are there, they say, for countering piracy at this moment, but in actual fact they are there to meet their own strategic reasons. If theoretically piracy were to be taken off the map instantaneously, they'll not go away, they'll continue to be there. They were there before piracy.
Would we also be there whether
No.
or not piracy is there?
No, we will not be there. We were there actually to respond to piracy. We would be there if some other interest develops. And that interest of ours is...
So
to
what
Strait
are
of
those
Hormuz.
interests? That's what I would like you to
Yes, that is the
dwell
Strait
upon.
Strait of Hormuz is the energy line. And of course, in maritime cooperation, you don't have to look after entirety of your own thing. The days of United States being for 60 years the provider of, underwriter of maritime security in this region are gone past. Before that, say the UK Royal Navy did that, but they also gone past. Now the days are of cooperation and collaboration between nations. So whoever is close by and is able to provide cooperation, that is what will determine this. So we can cooperate like India did. An excellent initiative India had taken in taking in Sri Lanka and Maldives, making a trilateral maritime cooperation and then extending it to Seychelles and Mauritius. Likewise, we can build up with others. We have close relations with Oman, which takes us right to the Strait of Hormuz. So this.
But these countries, Seychelles, Mauritius, Oman, and Sri Lanka, you said Maldives. Now, what kind of naval capabilities would these countries be able to bring in, which can have an impact in the region?
By themselves, very little. In fact, for most of them, for Mauritius, for Maldives, for Seychelles, we are doing the tasking for them. We are doing their EZ, patrol, etc. But at least that makes for friendly, cooperative endeavor between the two nations, understandings between the two peoples, and remove the question mark of uncertainty or insecurity in the minds of those people. Now that's what maritime cooperation is all about. So whether they help us or we help them at a given point in time is a matter of much greater detail.
What you're saying is that there is a convergence of interests among large countries like India and smaller countries, whether it is Maldives or Seychelles or medium-sized countries like Mauritius, Sri Lanka, etc., in ensuring that these sea lanes of communication are kept open.
Absolutely.
But this is something which is of wider interest as well. Let me turn to Indonesia for a minute, Suhasini, because we have just seen there is a new president, President Joko Widodo, who was sworn in on 20th of October, and in his swearing-in speech, apparently he used this Sanskrit phrase "Jal se vajay mahe," which is loosely translated as "At sea we are triumphant." And in this speech, he also talked about old links, cultural links, civilizational links with India, which were carried along the sea routes. And not many people realize that the southeasternmost tip of Nicobar, of the Andaman Nicobar group, the Nicobar group of islands, is about 100 nautical miles from the northeastern tip of Indonesia.
In fact, I think we only realized it during the tsunami when Aceh was closer to some of our naval
Absolutely. So what does this imply? I mean, Indonesia is a major country. It's a large country with which is spread out across from east to west, covering thousands of kilometers, has a naval presence and a tradition of cooperation with India going back centuries.
I think what you're seeing is, in the past, it has been accepted that India is not assertive in this region, that India has not taken the initiative in terms of reaching out to East Asia in the way that East Asian countries had hoped for, perhaps in the past. And now, as they reach out to India, they're hoping that India is taking that greater role, perhaps. Prime Minister Modi has spoken about looking east and acting east. Each of these visits that we are seeing is in fact increasing the engagement much further. We're going to see Prime Minister Modi on the 11th of November go to the East Asian Summit as well, and a lot of the bilaterals over there will look at this.
And Indonesian President will also be attending the East Asian Summit.
That's right. And then he goes to the G20. And I think we also have to...
Where again President Jokowi will be there.
Absolutely. And President Jokowi and of course Prime Minister Modi have a lot more in common, just in terms of they come from simpler backgrounds, they have become politicians, very strong men.
Both strong communicators.
They're seen as big communicators there. I think also one has to put in that note of caution that one must not see any of these engagements in terms of an anti-big power engagement. This is India reclaiming, if you like, ancient ties with all of these countries, where you saw the kind of cultural ties there were when the Vietnamese Prime Minister was here. He went first to Bodh Gaya. He spoke about the connections with India over there as well. And I think each of these countries also are building stronger ties with countries like China. Even as the Vietnamese Prime Minister was here, the State Councillor Yang Jiechi was in Hanoi for high-level meetings as well. I don't think we can afford to be in any way disregard what is happening in this region. I think what is important is that we are getting more engaged, and that's showing results.
Yogi, let me give you the last word. We're going to see both at the East Asian Summit and at the G20 in Australia in November, both meetings taking place in November, and Prime Minister Modi will be attending both of them. And many of the players from this region and outside the region who have naval presence and who have a stake, as Admiral said, in keeping the sea lanes of communication open, will be around. So do you think that this marks a shift? It marks a shift to, as Suhasini said, in the past there was a certain expectation about India which we failed to meet. Now, with India's membership of the ASEAN Regional Forum, our presence at the Shangri-La Dialogue, our presence at the Asian Defence Ministers meeting, ADMM Plus, and now with this coming up, do you think this will mark a significant, discernible shift?
I think India's one major component of India's diplomacy actually is maritime diplomacy, and it is actually, in a way, it is a larger issue. It is not just a question of unblocking the possible blocking of choke points. It is the larger issue of seeing that the smooth flow of trade and traffic is not impeded either by, let's say, great power intervention, but also by pirates or terrorists or general instability in the littoral area. So these are actually a very large number of issues which actually go when you talk about maritime security, including environmental degradation. So in all of that, you find that there is you say that diplomatic sort of mechanisms, whether you have the Indian Ocean Rim Association or you have the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, for example, or as you said, the ADMM Plus, and in all of them you have all the maritime security issues in terms of capacity building, in terms of building relationships, whether it's multilateral or bilateral. In all of that, India actually has a major role to play and can play a major role because we have the capacity, we have the assets and the experience to share with people, and actually, as I said, for example, constabulary role for you know, keeping the sea lanes safe. It's something which requires capacity building in many of the countries on the littoral. So in all of these issues, and even, for example, you find that the Navy or the Coast Guard, their role in what you call stabilization missions in the littoral countries, you know, these are major challenges for all of us. And as I just said, that I think it's the beginning of an architecture which is developing. The question actually is that this effort is in some way being clouded by the great power tension, in this particular case China and the US and Japan and this area.
But nonetheless, I think it would be fair to conclude at this point that the growing maritime engagement perhaps has within it the nucleus of an Asia-Pacific security architecture.